Non-US citizens of Reddit, what do your schools teach you about the United States? I went to school in Spain. In history class, the only US-related stuff we learned was the American Revolution, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. German here. In history class, the US is really only mentioned in context of the World Wars or the Cold War, and even then the focus is on their involvements with Europe and Germany in particular. Apart from that, the discovery and maybe a footnote about the Revolutionary War, the US barely appears, though I didn't further pursue history in my high school years, so maybe more is taught there. In English class, the civil rights movement and the American dream are popular themes to center debates around in high school, but overall there is a much greater focus on Great Britain and their former territories. This is what I remember, and it's a bit wordy but maybe you'd be interested. From the Philippines here. 1. Manifest Destiny, not a lot of discussion. 2. Spanish-American and eventual Philippine-American War. They promised us independence and liberation from the Spanish to fight with them in the Spanish-American War. When the Philippines declared independence, they fought a war to keep the Philippines. Filipino-American War, because they had purchased us through the Treaty of Paris. 3. They brought in the first American teachers, called Thomasites, for the ship they came on if I recall correctly. 4. World War II. They held out for a few months with our Filipino soldiers and were also in the Bataan Death March. General MacArthur made and kept a promise to return and liberate us, and upon Japan's surrender they gave us independence. We were a commonwealth at the time. Fun fact, the 4th of July is Filipino-American Friendship Day, aka Philippine Republic Day. I didn't do history in 11 or 12, so really ground level crap. The US exists. Washington was this guy. They got independence from the UK. The Oregon Trail had all the dysentery. WW1, 2, and Vietnam happened. JFK was a dude. Armstrong went on a road trip for a few days. Those cowboy and Indian movies. Those Indians were probably not treated super well. It wasn't, realistically, until the internet and facts on demand that my history knowledge increased. Now I know it was Armstrong and Buzz and Collins on that road trip. Chinese mainlander here. A lot, though most of these were covered in very general terms. How much you needed to learn also depended on whether you choose arts and humanities or science for university entrance exam. My Chinese high school education stopped after 10th grade, so these are not all. But from my memories, we learned about Columbus' discovery, Mayflower and Protestants, Boston Tea Party and the founding of US, American Civil War, and then the Great Depression and Roosevelt's New Deal. US is also mentioned but not mainly discussed when learning about the colonialization of parts of China, especially their military involvement during the Boxer Revolution, and then the World War II, forming of United Nations, Korean Wars, and briefly about Cold War. Also, we needed to learn about Nixon, because of the ping-pong diplomacy between him and Mao. In politics class we also needed to learn about the division of power in US Constitution. Thanks for my first Reddit gold, stranger. I'm surprised you learned that much about US history, to be honest. Sounds pretty comprehensive. Honestly, not a lot. The 1776 Revolution is like an intro to our massive chapter about the French Revolution. And that's pretty much it. I mean, we learn about the World Wars and the Cold War, but we never learned about the Civil War and stuff. In history class we were taught the following. I'm German BTW. Columbus discovering America and the first settlers. Declaration of Independence and Civil War happened sometime. Not many details, just that it existed. World War II and the Cold War, although the focus was on Germany and how they supported the European economy with the Marshall Plan. Vietnam War happened. No details. It's just mentioned. In English class we talked about the electoral system, that apparently many people in the US are very religious and kind of prudish. IDK if that's true. That evolution and sex education isn't taught in schools and that homeschooling is allowed. Yes, we actually did discuss those topics in class. I think that's it. But we don't get taught more about other countries either. Evolution is taught in public school, not always in private schools, and we do have sex ed. It varies from place to place, but where I'm from it's an abstinence based one, which is probably the most common version of sex ed. Nothing. I'm South African. So most of our history is based on our own apartheid issues, and that's kind of cool to me. Most of my knowledge about American history have been learned through reading books, watching documentaries and watching South Park. It just seems like the US government makes decisions for the betterment of its people, and in some instances that involves raping another country. It's like you have a US president that would do something fricked up, but then a group of American activists that will condemn it, so in a way no one really hates America. For more information, watch season 7 episode 4 of South Park. And I'm not even mad about it. It's smart. I feel like that's why America has this strong emphasis on lefts and rights, Democrats, Republicans. That way when one party does something wrong, the world doesn't hate the US because the opposing party condemns it and holds protests and Twitter trends. It's incredibly smart. No one hates America for Iraq, Vietnam or Liberia. Or at least no one that matters to the American economy. Whoa, never thought of this political duality in a positive light. Thanks for the new perspective. I live in France, and in history geography class, which are taught by a single teacher, they mainly teach us about 3 things related to the USA. The big battles of the USA during World War II, Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the 6th of June 1944, Total War, etc. They also teach about the Americanization of the world, hard and soft power, globalization, etc., and the Cold War Middle East era. And in English class we learn about more cultural and sometimes political stuff related either mostly on US or on England depending on the teacher. The problem is that the teachers are often from left political views and assume it's the obviously right way. Things like mountains, lakes, rivers, mineral resources, export and import goods, etc. We had to learn those basic data about almost all countries in the world. Sounds like a plot to eventually take over countries with the best mineral resource wealth. Chilean here. There was a dictatorship in the 70s and 80s and the US financed a lot. The CIA was also involved in the torturing of people and killings, and of course covering the obvious human rights violation in my country. Maybe they don't teach that at American schools. They don't, but we all pretty much figure it out by ourselves by our teens or 20s, so take that how you will. I'm Irish, and here we are taught about the Civil War, their involvement in World War II and how they accepted immigration, like during the Irish diaspora, and the civil rights movement as well as the Vietnam War. Accepted might be a strong word for how we treated Irish immigrants. From Taiwan, Republic of China. Well, general geography and stuff sums up. History about revolution and purchases here and there. Numerous were mentioned in a paragraph or 2 from US Civil War to Gulf War. Also stuff about how we're the allies in WW2. They aid us in the 1950s and 1960s. Oh, and cutting diplomatic ties with us. Thanks Nixon Carter. Hopefully, that changes. Many here in the States would much rather have normalized relations with Taiwan, instead of the People's Republic. In Brazil we commonly study what led the US to become independent but not the war itself. World War I, World War II, the 29 crisis and what you guys did and do in Middle East. The Civil War and Cold War II, and everything related to Brazil's history. They bought us from a 333-year colonization from Spain to give us freedom but exploited us for another 100 or so years. Here in Brazil they teach about the American Revolution and a little bit about the independence process, but the topic that they teach in most details is the Cold War, mostly because the US basically imposing dictatorships all over Latin America after Cuba, including Brazil. All I remember is them glossing over Civil War, talking about how your slaves fled to Canada. Every year we learned about the Underground Railroad, like we were heroes or SNTH. And how we took the White House and essentially beat your butt during the War of 1812. Mind you, they essentially glossed over anything horrible Canada ever did, so like propaganda much. War of 1812, not 1775. Mexican here. America bad. Took Texas and petroleum. America likes war. Pancho Villa was amazing. He was a rapist a-hole. So basically shitting on everything that wasn't Mexico. NGL they did take Texas, but let's not forget Mexico's leaders are mostly historically stupid money hungry bastards that care 0% about others and 100% about themselves and their families. As in America, that is likely true. I don't live in Texas, so we don't about Texas. We only learn about the state we live in and part of the first 13 states or something. In elementary school they taught us that there is no typical American in terms of looks. With that I mean that an American can be white, brown, black, etc. Also that it's a melting pot with many different cultures. So we kids had the image of the US as being diverse and also respectful and tolerant towards all different skin colored people. That's so sweet and innocent. I love it. I'm in England and we aren't taught much at all about the US. What we were taught was in GCSE about the colonization and the removal and murders of Native Americans, however it was very brief. I think Americans tend to forget that the history of the USA itself is so brief compared to most of the rest of the world that we don't really care. I went to an American international school and took world history for freshman and sophomore year. But I did not choose American history in junior or senior year. We watched Saving Private Ryan and The Hunt for the Red October. That's all I remember. Later on I read about all the stuff the CIA did in Latin America and a podcast on Chiquita. As a Latino, that made my blood boil and totally changed my perception of the United States, corporations, and the CIA. Check out the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman if you can get your hands on it. Scary stuff. The only 2 times that the United States appeared in our school books was the chapters we had on World War I and World War II and its aftermath in history. We were taught about why the US entered into the war and that it emerged as the strongest political and financial power after each of the wars. They teach us a lot about the political side of things and how the system needs improvement, as well as a little bit about the economy and the global trade. Most of the negative stuff I hear about the US comes from the news. From Australia BTW. England. We learnt about America's role in World War II. We learnt about the Prohibition and immigration melting pot. We learnt about discovering America and some things that happened from then until about the 1920s. So basically not as in detail as US schools. Americans, what did you learn about England in school? I'm very interested that some others didn't learn much about English history. I learned about the Battle of Hastings, a ton about the Glorious Revolution, Oliver Cromwell, Victoria, Elizabeth, etc., and a fair bit about the UK in World War II. Nothing much. We get basic info about the US becoming independent, and aside from really important events, like the Great Depression, we don't know much about the US. Greetings from Croatia. Also we know Coca-Cola uses slave to produce that delicious carbonated and sugary fluid. Sugar, English makes no sense and it's my native language. It's sad, IDK actually, to say that most school history is just about the country and a little bit about neighbors, mentioned if something directly affecting us happened like war or treaty. On one hand, the land does indeed have a very rich history spanning millennia. On the other hand, it'd be cool to know about kinda recent history of the currently prominent countries. Major global events are mentioned and sometimes discussed briefly though. Iraq BTW. Whoa, we only have less than 300 years of history and we can barely fit it into our curriculum. I can't imagine trying to fit millennia of history into just several years of schooling. Everything I learned about Iraq Mesopotamia was out of school. Fascinating history. I'd love to visit someday when crap settles down. Australian here. We use American material in our learning. For example, read American literature, look at a few case studies from the US in geography, use US textbooks. We don't really learn anything about the US though. In history America is mentioned for passing in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, but certainly in core history the focus is on Australia's part in those wars. I didn't take elective history, but I know they look at America more in that. In history and English we look at the civil rights movements, and in English we look at themes such as the American dream and stuff, but not much more than that. Also in geography we debate about issues relevant to US politics, namely a certain president, as much as we discuss our own politics. But that's just because my class likes debating, not because it's part of the curriculum or anything. Not much. but the United States is pretty good at teaching everyone about the United States simply by being the United States and by doing United Statusy things. Basically all we hear about the US in school is how much they go to war everywhere and that their only loss was Vietnam, where they were being absolutely brutal to innocent people. In history, almost nothing. In geography, they usually teach about the fault lines and mountains longing through the west coast. In year 7 or 8 we talked about national parks and some of the presidents. We made presentations for both topics. In year 12 the overall topic of our English lessons was African American history in the US and the Civil War. Very interesting TBH. In my economics and politics class we sometimes talked about US politics. We will probably do that again in November. I grew up in South America, so I learned about the British, Spaniards, Dutch, and Portuguese slave masters. The only thing I learned that was related to the United States was the fact that the indigenous people suffered a similar fate as the South American natives when the European settlers stole their lands. I haven't seen a French answer yet, so let's fix this. I just want to say that in high school I specialized myself in history, so I may know a bit more than other French. Basically, we learn much more about the US than about any other country, which is weird considering the relationship between France and the UK or Germany. Of course, the older we are, the more in depth we go, but here is what we know at the end of high school. First of all, we learned that when the US declared independence we had just lost a war against the UK, so to pay them off we helped the US. We also learned that we tried to do the same thing in France, but it ended differently. We learn a lot about the Civil War, but we go really in depth, never understood why, and we learned very young about it. Then we learned that because of some telegraph the US weirdly entered into World War I, but it didn't do anything, military speaking. My teacher often say they were useless, except sending us iron. But for World War II it's the other way around. We learn how bold they were, how they sacrificed themselves to free France. We also learn about Pearl Harbor and the Manhattan Project. We learn their role in the Cold War, leaders of the free world, Marshall Plan. We study how they became the world's first power, military and economy, how they created the UNO, FMI and how it benefits them. We study the Civil War movement also a lot, and then we learn about 2001 and how they've been aggressive since then. Et voila. Canada here. War of 1812 where we burnt down the White House was a memorable one. In English we briefly mocked their spelling and in math we mocked their number systems. Literally they used America as a punchline. We used to own it, but you butt hats couldn't enjoy drinking tea or our finely tailored red coats. This is why you don't have your own series of Doctor Who. Canadian here. A course option at my high school was American history. Curriculum was from the Mayflower up to around Nam, with larger units focusing on the Civil War, Henry Ford, World Wars, and the Civil Rights Movement, all of which was postponed, however, a few days into the 2001 to 2002 school year. I'm 13, so there's definitely going to be more to learn in school, but so far, all we have discussed is the Civil Rights Movement in the USA. I teach primary, elementary, so we don't do a unit on individual countries unless it's in geography and students choose a particular country for a project. I'd assume that student knowledge of the US is pretty basic. Most could probably name the capital, and a few key facts. They all know Donald Trump. They all mock Donald Trump. UK A-level history I did America 1865 to 1975. Actually not great stuff to be fair. We did African Americans, the economy, women, immigration, foreign policy, the presidents etc. Quite focused on the robber barons and stuff like that too. Philippines here. This was 15 years ago, so I DK if they still teach the same. We learned things about the US, mostly about the Spanish-American War, which we were part in being as we were a Spanish colony that the US took over. This led to Philippine-American War, which the US won and took us as a colony. Then we were slowly being given autonomy to independence, but Japan invaded. US became our savior and an ally, and ever since then America is regarded as our big friend across the ocean that is ready to defend us against our Asian neighbors and communism. Hollywood action movies and products, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, further reinforced the idea that America is the dream and protector for the poor to escape poverty. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.